When you picture a thousand-year-old city, um, the image that usually comes to mind is something just totally frozen in time.
Right, like a living museum or something.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. You imagine you visit, you look at all these preserved artifacts, you whisper respectfully in the ancient temples, and then you leave.
You just assume the city has always been this quiet, undisturbed sanctuary.
But looking closely at the actual history of Kyoto, well, it shatters that expectation completely. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and our mission today is to look far beyond that standard postcard image of serene temples and geishas.
And I'm the resident historian for this deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to get into these sources today because, honestly, the reality of Kyoto is way more gritty and dynamic than any tourist brochure is going to tell you.
It really is. If you dig into the source material, you uncover this fascinating reality of a city that is defined by brutal cycles of violent destruction, radical reinvention, and just a shocking amount of hypermodernity.
Yeah, it operates much more like a highly adaptable organism. I mean, it survived purely because it was willing to drastically alter its own structure whenever it faced an existential threat.
Which is something I think you, the listener, can probably relate to. Like if you have ever had to completely reinvent yourself after a massive life setback, or maybe navigate a sudden, terrifying career shift, Kyoto is basically the ultimate historical case study in how to pivot aggressively.
But doing it without losing your core identity, that's the key part.
Right. We are talking about a supposedly ancient traditional city that quietly built Japan's first commercial electric railway.
Which is still wild to think about.
It is, and it secretly serves as the birthplace for some of the biggest electronics and video game empires in the world.
Nintendo, anyone.
Exactly. So to understand how that happened, we kind of have to start at the very beginning with the city's original blueprint.
Yeah, so to trace that blueprint, we need to jump back to the year 794. Emperor Kanmu made this monumental decision to move the capital.
And he had a very specific reason for doing that, right?
He did. He specifically wanted to distance his court from the really powerful, entrenched Buddhist clerical establishment that had kind of taken over the previous capital of Nara.
They're just getting too influential.
Right. So he chooses a completely new location in the Yamashiro Basin.
But they didn't just casually set up a new base of operations, like pitching some tents. The origin of this city, which was originally called Hankyu, was an exercise in intense, rigid control over the physical environment.
Oh, the level of spatial micromanagement was staggering.
Yeah.
The planners modeled the new capital directly on the ancient Chinese capital of Chang'an.
So they were basically copying the biggest, most impressive city they knew.
Exactly. And they arranged everything in strict accordance with traditional Chinese feng shui principles. I mean, it was an attempt to mandate cosmic peace and political order literally through urban planning.
The mechanics of that grid are just fascinating to visualize. You have the imperial palace placed deliberately so it faces south.
Right, right.
And this mathematical alignment divided the city perfectly down the middle. So you had a right sector on the west called Yuki and a left sector on the east called Sakyu.
And the streets were laid out at perfect, inflexible right angles, like a massive chessboard.
Yeah. And you can actually still navigate this grid pattern today if you walk around the central wards of the city.
But the underlying assumption of that architecture, it's all about control. You align the avenues with spiritual forces. You put every merchant, every noble, and temple in a designated sector.
Everything in its right place.
Exactly. You operate under the belief that your empire is going to be as permanent and unbreakable as the masonry you just laid down.
It makes me think of a perfectly formatted, locked Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. It's mathematically beautiful. Every piece is exactly where it belongs, but it's incredibly brittle, like a massive glass grid. And if you apply enough sudden pressure to a rigid glass grid, it doesn't just bend, it completely shatters.
And that pressure definitely arrived. It came in the form of the Yun War.
Right. The Great Shattering.
Yeah, so the Indian War ran from 1467 to 1477. And this is the event that truly broke that original blueprint.
Set the scene for us a bit. What was happening in Japan at the time?
Well, this conflict happened during the Sengoku period. And that was this massive, chaotic era of warring states in Japan, where central authority basically collapsed.
So everyone is just fighting for power.
Pretty much. Relentless military conflict among regional warlords.
And the sources paint a really terrifying picture of what this meant for Kyoto specifically. Because this wasn't a war fought by professional armies on some distant, muddy battlefield somewhere else.
No, the battles between these rival samurai factions spilled directly into the meticulously planned avenues of the capital itself.
They were fighting in the streets.
Right in the streets. The physical transformation of the city was apocalyptic. Court nobles were forced to heavily fortify their elegant wooden mansions.
Like turning them into military bases.
Exactly. They basically became bunker complexes, and they dug massive, deep defensive trenches right through the middle of the urban grid,
Just ripping up the feng shui layout.
tearing it apart.
Yeah.
They used them as fire breaks and fortifications against enemy samurai. And over the course of a decade, much of that perfectly aligned city simply burned to the ground.
That level of destruction, I mean, it suggests a complete psychological reset for the people living there. They learned the hard way that rigid perfection completely fails when human chaos enters the equation.
You definitely can't rely on a delicate glass grid when armies are burning down your streets.
So going back to that Excel analogy, the Shinin War was basically the virus that completely scrambled the data.
I like that, yeah. And that realization really defined the city's first great pivot. When the powerful warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi finally took on the task of reconstructing Kyoto in the late 16th century, he was like the IT guy who had to rebuild the whole file with a totally new formatting logic.
Right, he discarded that illusion of peaceful perfection.
Entirely. He redesigned the city for structural resilience. He built these massive earthwork walls called odoi that physically encircled the city for defense.
And he also changed the fundamental geometry of the neighborhoods, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Hideyoshi drove completely new streets right through the center of the old grid, which doubled the number of north-south roads.
Just slicing the old blocks in half.
Exactly. More importantly, he replaced those ancient, perfectly square city blocks with rectangular ones.
What does that actually do, mechanically speaking?
It allows for denser, more defensible urban housing. He even created a specific quarter, Teramachi Street, with the sole purpose of gathering all the potentially rebellious Buddhist temples into one centralized location.
Oh, so he could keep an eye on them.
Right, so his forces could just watch them closely.
So by building those earthwork walls and restructuring the blocks, Hideyoshi essentially replaced that brittle glass grid with a flexible, defensive steel cage.
That's a great way to look at it. The people who survived those trenches, they learned that survival requires constant adaptation. You shift the blocks, you build the walls, you change the layout.
So did this massive trauma permanently change the psychological identity of the city?
It really did. That specific psychological shift, moving from an expectation of theoretical perfection to a mindset of practical, gritty resilience that becomes the defining characteristic of Kyoto.
And they would desperately need that resilience a few centuries later, because that newly adaptable walled city was about to face a threat that no earthwork wall could possibly keep out.
Right, moving into the 19th century.
Yeah, 1869, the Meiji Restoration.
So the political landscape of Japan shifts dramatically during this time, and the emperor relocates the capital from Kyoto to Tokyo.
Which is huge. After 11 centuries of operating as the center of the Japanese universe, the quote-unquote 1,000-year capital suddenly loses its emperor.
It's devastating. The economic vacuum described in these sources is just hard to overstate.
Because the court didn't just take the emperor, right? They took the patrons who bought the textiles. They took the administrative bureaucracy.
And all the geopolitical prestige.
Kyoto was staring down the very real possibility of becoming an abandoned ghost town.
A lesser city would have simply faded into a minor historical footnote right then and there. But the city government and local business leaders, they executed this highly coordinated, incredibly aggressive plan to modernize their infrastructure.
They didn't just sit around building monuments to their past glory.
No, they focused on heavy industrial mechanics.
And the centerpiece of the survival plan was the Lake Biwa Canal.
Yeah, construction started in 1885 and finished in 1890. This was a massive engineering feat for the time.
They literally carved a 20-kilometer waterway through the mountains.
Right, just to link Lake Biwa directly to Kyoto.
And digging that canal wasn't just about creating a scenic waterway for transport. The physical mechanics of this project were entirely focused on modernization.
Exactly. I mean, the canal provided reliable drinking water and agricultural irrigation, sure, but the most crucial output was hydroelectric power.
Hydroelectric power in the 1890s.
It fundamentally altered the economic trajectory of Kyoto. That electricity fueled a sudden explosion of modern factories across the city.
And by 1895, that same hydroelectric infrastructure was powering Japan's very first commercial electric railway.
Built right there in the historic capital.
I mean, I'm looking at this timeline and it feels completely contradictory. You have this population that is desperate to save their status as the ancient historic capital, but they're doing it by tearing up the ground to lay electric railway tracks.
It does seem counterintuitive.
The visual history of the city was being altered too. I mean, in 1895, they built the Kyoto National Museum, but they designed it in a French Second Empire architectural style.
Which drew really harsh criticism from a lot of locals at the time. They felt it completely clashed with the imperial capital's history.
How did the local leadership justify eroding the traditional visual identity of the city just to survive? I mean, the irony is crazy. Millions of people travel to Kyoto today specifically to see traditional Japan, but in the 1890s, the locals were frantically building European-style museums and power plants.
Well, the local leadership viewed that European modernity not as a rejection of their history, but as the necessary structural armor required to protect it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you simply cannot afford the immense upkeep of 2,000 historic temples and shrines if your municipal government goes bankrupt.
Right.
So to maintain their cultural soul, they aggressively engineered an industrial heartbeat.
And they expanded their borders to support that heartbeat, too.
They did. In 1918 and again in 1931, the city government actually absorbed neighboring towns like Fushimi.
Specifically to secure cheap, available land for modern factories and worker housing, right?
Exactly. They basically cordoned off the historic core and built this massive industrial engine around it to generate revenue.
So they wired a 1,000-year-old city for heavy industry just to ensure they could keep the lights on in the ancient monasteries.
That's a perfect summary.
And that industrial armor successfully saved their economy. But the actual physical buildings we associate with Kyoto today, the wooden tea houses, the ancient shrines, those only survived because of a razor-thin stroke of historical luck during a global conflict.
Yes. The end of World War II presented another completely existential threat to Kyoto.
The United States military was actively evaluating targets for the atomic bomb.
And Kyoto was placed very high on that list.
The reasoning for that was entirely strategic, according to the sources. Because of Kyoto's immense historical, cultural, and psychological importance to the Japanese people, military planners theorized that destroying it might force an immediate psychological collapse.
Right. They thought it would lead to a swift surrender.
But the city was spared.
It was spared due to the direct intervention of the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson.
He vehemently insisted on removing Kyoto from the target list.
Yeah, reportedly because he had personally visited the city before the war, and he understood its irreplaceable cultural value to global human history.
And as a result of his persistent pushback, Nagasaki was chosen as the alternative target.
Furthermore, Kyoto was largely spared from the conventional firebombing campaigns that totally decimated other major urban centers.
Right. While cities like Tokyo and Osaka were just leveled to ash, and then later had to be forced to rebuild entirely with modern concrete in the 1950s, Kyoto kept its pre-war architectural footprint intact.
The traditional Machiya wooden townhouses, the historic storefronts, the thousands of ancient temples, they physically survived the war.
And the aftermath of that preservation created a really unique economic launchpad.
It really did, because Kyoto emerged from the war with its historical infrastructure untouched, its population largely unharmed, and its massive 1890s industrial base completely intact.
The city was basically perfectly positioned to dominate the post-war economic boom.
Exactly. Which brings us to the modern identity of the city.
Yeah, modern Kyoto is like a cutting-edge stealth tech startup operating out of a 1,000-year-old monastery. It quickly evolved into a massive hub for global information technology and precision electronics.
We're talking about the headquarters for absolute titans of industry.
Nintendo, Omron, Kyocera.
Nidec Corporation, Shimadzu. It functions essentially as the Silicon Valley of Japan, with cutting-edge semiconductor research happening just down the street from SMPTE's old Zen rock gardens.
I am struggling to connect these dots mechanically, though. Like, on one side of the city, you have artisans utilizing generationally perfected techniques to brusake or weave intricate kimonos. And then on the other side of the city, you have engineers coding globally dominant video games and designing micromotors for electronics. How do these two completely different worlds exist in the same ecosystem, producing such high-level output without fundamentally clashing?
Well, they don't clash because they actually share the exact same mechanical DNA.
Really?
Yeah, the skills are simply being applied to different materials.
Hmm.
If you look at the physical processes involved in traditional Kyoto craftsmanship, you see the blueprint for modern tech manufacturing.
Okay, give me an example.
Consider the famous kimono weavers. The process of multi-layered dyeing requires an intense microscopic level of precision. A master artisan must align physical stencils and apply chemicals in a perfectly sequenced, highly controlled environment.
Where a millimeter of error ruins the product.
Exactly.
Which sounds identical to the cleanroom environment required to print silicon wafers for semiconductors.
The methodology is virtually identical. That cultural obsession with hyper-focus, iterative layering, and zero-defect quality control was already deeply ingrained in the local workforce.
Wow.
When the materials changed from silk and dye to silicon and copper, the workforce didn't have to learn a new work ethic. They just picked up new tools.
That makes so much sense. And Nintendo is the perfect case study for this pipeline.
Oh, absolutely. Nintendo's corporate history perfectly illustrates this transition.
Because they didn't just spring into existence as a video game company in the 1980s.
Not at all. Nintendo was actually founded in Kyoto back in 1889.
Right, during that exact waves of industrialization driven by the Lake Biwa Canal.
Yes. And their original business was manufacturing traditional Hanafuda playing cards.
And making those cards was a deeply physical, artisanal process.
It was. It required sourcing thick mulberry bark paper, applying clay, and mastering highly precise printing and painting techniques.
Just to ensure every single card was uniform and durable enough for heavy use.
Right. So Nintendo spent decades mastering the mass production of a high-quality physical entertainment product.
And that physical infrastructure and that institutional knowledge of material scaling seamlessly, that allowed them to pivot.
Exactly. They pivoted into manufacturing plastic toys in the mid-20th century and eventually into engineering physical hardware and writing airtight video game code.
So the tech giants in Kyoto are not an anomaly at all.
No, they are the direct, modern iteration of ancient artisanal discipline.
And the city also heavily engineered its educational infrastructure to feed this exact ecosystem, didn't they?
They did. Kyoto boasts 40 institutions of higher education. Kyoto University alone has produced a remarkable number of Nobel laureates.
So they consciously built an environment that rewards deep, methodical thinking and precision engineering.
Exactly. The monk sweeping the rock garden and the microchip engineer designing a circuit board are operating on the exact same core philosophy of spatial perfection and meticulous execution.
But, and this is a huge but, the sources point to a severe modern crisis.
Yeah, things are getting very complicated.
This incredibly delicate balancing act, layering a hyper-modern, dense industrial city directly on top of an ancient heritage site, it's currently facing an existential threat. The very mechanisms that made Kyoto successful are starting to cannibalize the city.
And the most glaring example of this is actually happening underground, with the water table.
Tell us about that, because this blew my mind.
So, the geographic reality of the Yamashiro Basin is that it sits on top of a massive, naturally occurring groundwater basin. Historically, this aquifer provided an incredibly ample supply of pure fresh water.
And that specific water chemistry is literally what made Kyoto's world-famous tofu possible, right?
Yes. And it provided the essential foundation for their centuries-old sake brewing industry, like companies like Gekkeiken.
But the infrastructure required to support a modern population of 1.4 million people has fundamentally altered that geography.
It has. The sheer volume of modern urbanization, the dense asphalt roads, the sprawling concrete foundations for office buildings, the subterranean subway networks.
It's all acting like a massive impermeable lid over the basin.
The physical mechanics of the water cycle have just been totally interrupted. Rainfall can no longer naturally permeate the soil and drain back into the earth to replenish the aquifer.
The water just hits the concrete and is immediately diverted into modern storm drains and flushed away.
Right. And because that permeation is blocked, the city's ancient historic wells, the very sources of water that supply the traditional tea ceremonies and sake breweries, are drying up at a deeply alarming rate.
The concrete required to maintain the modern city is literally starving the historical city of its most basic resource.
It's a tragedy. And this environmental strain is deeply intertwined with a massive economic strain, which is entirely driven by the city's reliance on global tourism.
Right. For a long time, the municipal strategy seemed to be a total victory. By leveraging their preserved architecture, they hit record highs of domestic and international tourism in 2014.
Oh yeah, millions of people poured into the city every year.
Just to walk through the Arashiyama bamboo forest, attend the Gion Matsuri festival, and visit all the World Heritage sites.
But the danger of an economy hyper-reliant on global tourism is its extreme brittleness.
Like that glass grid from earlier.
Exactly. When an external shock occurs, the revenue vanishes instantly. And this structural vulnerability was brutally exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic.
The international borders closed.
The tourists stopped coming.
And the economic engine stalled literally overnight. The financial impact detailed in these municipal reports is just staggering.
The loss of revenue was so severe that in 2021, the mayor of Kyoto actually issued a public warning about the very real possibility of bankruptcy in the next decade.
A major city warning about bankruptcy. That's wild.
They were forced to implement severe job cuts within the administration and significantly reduce social assistance programs.
Including vital funding for home care for the elderly, which is heartbreaking.
It is. And the financial crisis is also accelerating a demographic crisis. Kyoto serves as the cultural and economic anchor for a broader metropolitan area of 3.8 million people.
Right. It absorbs a massive daytime working population that commutes into the tech and business sectors.
Yet, despite this daily influx, the core residential population of Kyoto is steadily decreasing. In recent years, Kyoto actually led the entire country in population decline for 2 consecutive years.
Because the local residents are being priced out by luxury hotels, or they're just fleeing the overcrowding caused by the tourism industry.
Yeah, it presents a fascinating, almost tragic paradox.
It really does. Here is a city that survived a 10-year samurai war burning down its avenues and survived the catastrophic economic trauma of losing the imperial court to Tokyo. Yet today, it is being brought to its knees by drying aquifers and the unpredictable fluctuations of global tourism. Are we, as global tourists, just loving Kyoto to death?
It seems like it. The municipal government is basically trapped in a feedback loop. They absolutely need the massive revenue generated by tourism to fend the exorbitant maintenance costs of preserving 2,000 historical temples and shrines.
But processing that sheer volume of human traffic requires modern hotels, widened paved roads, and heavy transport networks.
And those concrete networks suffocate the natural water table, threatening the traditional industries that give the city its cultural flavor in the first place.
Pulling all of these sources together, the main takeaways for anyone studying Kyoto are clear. This city is not just a passive museum waiting for visitors to take photographs of wooden buildings.
Far from it.
It is a masterclass in aggressive mechanical adaptation. When you trace the history from the shattered Chinese feng shui grids to the samurai trenches, to digging hydroelectric canals through mountains, to building French architecture in the imperial center, and eventually manufacturing microchips.
Kyoto survives because when pushed to the absolute brink of destruction, it is always willing to drastically rewrite its own operating code.
The historical record clearly shows that Kyoto's moments of greatest peril were consistently met with the most unorthodox, physically demanding solutions.
The local leaders didn't cling to the aesthetic of the past when the emperor left?
No. They picked up shovels, dug a canal, and powered up a railway. So the next time you feel immense pressure to strictly maintain your own personal traditions, or you find yourself stubbornly clinging to past ways of working simply because that is how it has always been done, look at the mechanics of Kyoto's survival.
Survival requires recognizing when the old blueprint is no longer functional.
True longevity often requires radical, unpopular innovation. You have to be willing to physically tear up your own foundation and build a European museum in the middle of your sacred capital if it means securing your economic future.
Exactly.
We want to leave you with a final concept to mull over today, drawn directly from that terrifying mechanical issue with the water table. The ancient, life-giving wells of Kyoto are drying up precisely because of the concrete lid required to build the modern, profitable city on top of them.
That lid is sealing them off.
Right. So in your own life, your career, or your business, when you build shiny, heavy new structures to protect your foundation and generate growth, at what point do those very structures become a concrete lid, starving the original source that made you great in the first place?